Right, let's get serious. RTX 4070 is here. Is this a graphics card that you should be buying? Well, this costs around about £580 or $600, depending on where you are in the world. And in terms of performance, this is kind of similar to something like an RTX 3080, except it packs things like DLSS 3.0 for better frame rate in Cyberpunk or anything that supports these sort of features, as well as better ray tracing support. And I guess with driver updates, this should get better over time. Oh, and we also have more VRAM, 12 gigabytes of this stuff, which is fantastic, right? Well, depending on who you ask, the rumour mill, this actually might not have enough for the future. So is the 4070 dead on arrival? Or is this actually a really good graphics card that you should be considering for your gaming PC? It's going to be an interesting one! So stay tuned to learn absolutely everything you need to know right after a short word from this video's sponsor. AlphaSync is the place to get the pre-built system of your dreams. Without any knowledge on how to build a PC, AlphaSync gets you top branded components at all budgets, lovingly put together right here in the UK. Either choose a master-crafted AlphaSync specification or design yours from scratch. The choice is entirely up to you. Get your game on today with that link down below. Okay then, let us begin. This video is actually going to be focusing on the Gigabyte Gaming OC, though we will also be touching on the Founders Edition that we've already made a video and build about. You can find this video in the top right corner of your screen, where we literally build this computer and look at its performance. But let's get this under the overhead and actually do ourselves a little unboxing. And you should be aware that pricing is going to vary depending on the SKU that you buy. I think NVIDIA are actually being quite strict that all AIBs at least need or should have a card that is going to cost the recommended retail price of that $589 or that $600. But cards like this can actually be a little bit more expensive. And indeed, here we have the Gigabyte Gaming OC. It's actually a very attractive card. I think this looks better than the more expensive 4070 Ti and 4080s because it is actually a fair bit smaller, and I guess the design is just a bit more well-rounded. I mean, when you compare it against something like the Aorus 4090 Master, it looks absolutely ridiculous. This is not a small card, yet compared to this, it really does look tiny. This looks to be a 2.5 getting on for 3-slot card, whereas this is, well, 3 to 4. It's pretty crazy, but this is a very extreme example. And don't forget that you're of course going to need a case that can actually accommodate these, not only for physical room, but also for cooling as well. And if you want to like front mount a radiator or something, then obviously you need a lot of space. But I think this card should fit into most people's rigs already. You've got loads of cooling on this. You can see you've got this pass-through design over here, a full backplate that looks and sounds like it's made out of metal. You've got a BIOS switch here for your silent versus OC modes. You've got your 12-volt high power connection on the top as well. If you do go for the more entry-level cards, you might find one that has a single 8-pin, but both the Founders Edition and the Overclock cards will have this new power connection. Personally, I think this is a good thing. It's a bit more future-proof. One cable can make your rig look a whole lot nicer, but I understand some people like what they have and they don't want to have to upgrade, or they were worried about concerns about plugging in properly, but I think we're past that now. In terms of our outputs, as a pretty standard NVIDIA affair, we've got one HDMI 2.1, which is good for 4K 120 for things like TVs or monitors. Then you've got 3 display ports, but they are limited to DisplayPort 1.4, not the 2.1 that you'll find over on the AMD cards. I really don't think it matters with something like this because we've not got enough horsepower to drive them anyway, but if you want to listen to the AMD marketing, or you actually are going to buy one of those monitors, then you should be aware that AMD is going to be a better choice. And of course, we should also mention that inside the box you get this wonderful thing, which is your 2x8-pin to one 12 or 16-pin connection to actually get this card to work. Though to be fair, at the time of filming, there's loads of alternative cables you can buy now that will look a lot nicer, I suppose, or you can just buy a new power supply that actually will have this connection as standard. You don't have to do that, but if you want to sort of go for something like this, where it's a Corsair cable, it's braided, and it just looks a whole lot nicer, I think the overall effect is better than if you had loads of 8-pins, personally. Let us take our 4070 Founders Edition out so you can actually see a full-size comparison. And I mean, the difference is pretty noticeable if you put these two things side by side. I mean, this is a 2-slot GPU versus the 2.5, and obviously the length is very, very different. So I would say this would be great for like a smaller system, especially ITX, but of course it's the usual caveat that if you have something like the NZXT H1, where this is sort of going to blow straight into like a back panel where you've got literally metal behind the GPU, then actually it's not going to be the best choice because your thermal performance isn't going to be performing optimally. But if you do have a smaller rig in general, then obviously a smaller card, assuming you can get around this limitation, is going to be better. But this should have better thermals and better acoustics. But to be honest, spoiler alert for the rest of this video, this was already pretty much dead silent in operation and didn't get hot because it's so power efficient. So I'm already thinking, I'm not convinced, but I'd like to be proved wrong. Let's stack all of them up so you can see the difference. This is a 7900 XTX TUF, that is a lot bigger. And then this is a Gaming OC 3080 Ti. This is actually quite a nice little comparison because you can see, I guess it is actually quite similar to that. And it is ever so slightly smaller. And I would argue that the design is actually a fair bit nicer as well. I never really liked this sort of edge bit that's been cut out of this, and the fans actually look a bit nicer on this as well. But we'll wait and see until we get to performance whether this works, but I'd be very surprised if it doesn't. So, shall we get this inside our rig? Don't know what I'm asking you. Obviously, we're going to put it inside our rig. This is not a difficult bit, is it? Let's grab ourselves a monitor, the PC-Centric mouse mat that you can buy and get shipped. Not today, I think it's 2 to 3 days shipping, but you can get this quick. It's in stock. Link down below, pccentric.store. Best way to support the channel. And then all it needs is just a little push. Push. My jokes don't work when they don't work, do they? That was meant to be a Dark Knight reference, but whatever. You've ruined it now.
Oh, you're not funny.
Neither are you. Let's have a look. Well, we've got some sort of strobing going on with this GPU at the moment. You can obviously change all of this in software. That's quite a cool look though, I like that. Maybe not all of the time, but you've got some RGB on the bottom of the card and on the side where it says Gigabyte. We are running this in its overclocked modes, but obviously you can change all of this around when you download the software. And this is the main thing, right? If you do want to go for something like this, which is a more entry-level card, entry-level, £580, an entry-level card like this, you can actually whack on some software, give it your own fan curves, but more importantly, you can increase the power limit, increase the clock speeds, and you can even do this with the GeForce Experience overclocking tool now, so you can get more performance out of the box. The way to think about them is that they are dynamic and they will boost to actually get the most out of the power that they have available, but also the cooling, because they want to hit a certain thermal limit, and if they haven't got there, then you've got more overclocking headroom, and obviously the better cooling on the card, the more you can push it. That's the idea behind these custom overclock cards, because they have better cooling, you can push them further. But I would wager that both of these cards are probably going to have really good thermals to the point where you're going to overclock it to its limit anyway. Oh, don't you just love a Windows update? They're always at the best possible times. Now let us begin with a game I think a lot of people will be using this GPU for, some Apex Legends. And in terms of the settings, we're running this at 1440p. Pretty much everything is maxed out other than spot shadow detail, which is set to very high. And as we touch down on the ground and net ourselves some purple armor, great start, you can see we're actually getting a pretty monumental frame rate actually, around about 200 to 270 frames a second in Apex Legends. And that is impressive. And I think this is my, I guess, overarching view on this card, which is that this is still more performance than anyone really needs, because if you are going to be playing this at 1440p, which I would wager most gamers probably are anyway, then why do you actually need any more performance than 200 frames a second at 1440p? It's nice to have all of the extras, it's nice to be able to turn ray tracing on and all of these DLSS features, they're really useful, but if you're going to be playing multiplayer games, your core frame rate is probably the most important thing, and here if you're getting over 200 frames a second at pretty much max settings, that's probably all you need. But where things get slightly more murky is with 4K resolution, because this is one of those cards that a couple of years ago would be marketed as a 4K card, but now there's even bigger ones that sort of marketed as high 1440p. But I still say this is going to be a fine card for 4K gaming, regardless of whether you've got a 4K monitor or a 4K TV, because as you can see, we're still getting over 100 frames a second at 4K resolution, and Apex Legends isn't even a game that has DLSS or any sort of upscaling technique that would actually allow you to, not cheat, but to get extra frame rate by using DLSS technology, AI upscaling. Oh, we got trouble, we got trouble! I've got no ammunition, always good. Oh, blow. I mean, it is very hard to sort of crane your neck and see this. But point being, if you do want to play a multiplayer game, even at high resolutions like 4K or maybe 3840 by 1600, 3440 by 1440, ultra wide, anything like that, 4070 clearly is going to be an excellent choice, even over something like the 4070 Ti that has more performance but costs quite a lot more money. But as I say, multiplayer games are quite easy. What about literally the hardest thing you can play on this PC right now? Some Cyberpunk with the new Overdrive path tracing updates. If that doesn't sound exciting, I don't know what does. I mean, I could have sold that a bit more. The path tracing update! Once again, we'll start this at 1440p, but in terms of our options, we will begin with ray tracing entirely off, just the Ultra preset, with frame generation off, but DLSS set to quality. And here we are, getting around about 80 to 90 frames a second. We've got DLSS frame generation off, but DLSS super resolution set to quality. So this is pretty much how you'd want to play the game, I think, at 1440p if you didn't have ray tracing enabled. And this is giving you a good over experience. It's not as crazy as you're going to get on a 4090 or 4080, but obviously this is still plenty of horsepower for a game like this. Where things get a little bit tricky though is if we enable the ray tracing. So let's do this, but keep frame generation off, turn it on. We'll enable everything, set it to Ultra, and this is pretty much where we were with the 3080. Like, not a bad frame rate, about 65 to 70 FPS, which is still really good. I mean, who doesn't want to play Cyberpunk with ray tracing over 60 FPS? I mean, this is actually better than I expected. I thought we'd see a little bit more of a drop-off. We're losing, what, about 20 frames a second or so with ray tracing set to Ultra. So you can see how far we've come, actually, with this latest generation. I'm a fan of this test, actually. As I say, I didn't expect that. However, of course, this being a 40 series GPU, we can now go and enable DLSS frame generation, go back into the game, and essentially this dynamically inserts some frames with AI to give you an overall smoother experience at the cost of a little bit more latency. Compared to DLSS completely off, you're getting about the same sort of latency, or actually a little bit less, but we're getting about 55 to 60 milliseconds of latency with about 120 frames a second, and this is such a good way to play this game. But of course, speaking of cutting edge technology, there is that path tracing technology preview update, and I do think this is gonna make this PC sweat to the point where I think the 4070 might be a little bit underpowered, but let's give this a go. I mean, 1080p won't be a problem, but you're not buying a card like this for 1080p. I refuse to believe that. So let's go into graphics, scroll all the way to the bottom, path tracing, turn that on, and I'm guessing about 50 frames a second. Oh, yeah, that doesn't feel as good now. That does not feel as good now. Our frame rate is actually fairly high. We're getting about 76 frames a second or so, but the latency has jumped up to about 80 milliseconds. So it's nice that you can access this, but bear in mind this is an FPS game. I now do not like the way that this feels. That really does feel like we're getting maybe 40 frames a second or so in terms of like our true frame rate. That's what it feels like to me. But I mean, look how cool that looks. It really is a massive step up versus the normal ray tracing. It's a weird one because everything just looks so much more realistic, and it's almost quite difficult to explain because it's more than the sum of its parts. Everything adds up just to give you that really realistic implementation. I mean, it's still not perfect. I mean, give it like 5 years and all of these reflections and things that you'll get under here will be complete mirror images. These are clearly lower resolution than they would be if you were sort of doing, like, I guess, crazy level of path tracing with all of the detail and literally everything. But compared to it off, it looks absolutely fantastic. It really, really does. I mean, it's nice as a little demo just to walk around actually and see what your GPU is capable of. I mean, look at the reflections there. It's wild. Oh, and of course, what about the noise levels, the acoustics, the temperatures? Well, this is what it sounds like. Which actually is all the CPU cooler, because this is one of the issues at the moment if you go for like an Intel CPU and you overclock it, because this is drawing like 200 watts and all of the fans are sort of geared towards the CPU. The actual graphics card is quieter than the rest of the system. So clearly, if you do want to go for a really quiet system, the 4070 is a very decent choice. But of course, in order to actually test the thermals, we are going to have to put this side panel on. No cheating. I was going to save this to the end. Let's see if we can do some overclocking now, just to see if we can get any practical improvement to our Cyberpunk frame rate with all of the bells and whistles enabled. Oh, I was going to say this is 1440p still, and it's windowed, but it's crashed. I haven't even done any overclocking yet. So yes, here we are, all the bells and whistles, 1440p, windowed, and we're currently getting about 52, 54 frames a second. But if we go and overclock this even further, really simple, we'll just drag the power limit all the way, hit apply. Does that make any difference at the moment? No, maybe an extra frame. but I think that's placebo. So let's actually start fiddling with our clocks. Let's add 100, well 121 apparently. And our clock speed has improved, there we go, 2940. But as you can see, the frame rate pretty much does stay exactly the same. Push this up to 200. Now we're at 3000 megahertz, but this is probably entering borderline unstable territory. And we have gained a frame, which is nice. We definitely have gained a frame now, maybe 2 frames a second of extra performance. So there is some extra stuff under the hood if you want to mess about, but I would wager as soon as we go any further than this, we're probably going to see a crash. So there is a little bit of overclocking headroom in this, probably about 150 megahertz-ish that you can add. But as I seem to say in every single video that I'm doing on these graphics cards at the moment, they are already pretty much at the limit that there's not really that much extra you can get out of them. And if you can, it's not going to make any dramatic difference to your game, but it's always worth having a slight fiddle about. And I think we're fire up some Call of Duty Warzone 2. And this time we're going to start this at 4K resolution. In terms of quality, we've got this set to ultra, but the texture's turned up as high as possible. And you can see in terms of VRAM utilization, we're way under the 12 gigabytes, so no problem there. And in terms of our frame rate, bear in mind we're running this at 4K resolution with the DLSS set to quality. We're actually getting around about 100 FPS, and I think that is actually pretty impressive, because I think most people aren't actually going to be running this at 4K, and if you were, you'd probably lower down a few settings to try and nail about 120. So to be able to get 100 at the ultra preset, I think is actually very, very impressive. But I think 1440p is going to be more interesting for most people. And so here we go, let's do this again. Jumping out of the plane, are we going to see a big difference? Immediately, it doesn't look drastic, but it is certainly a little bit higher. I think it's fair to say we're probably getting an extra 15 to 20 frames a second or so. It is always going to vary depending on sort of when you are in the game, but it's not actually as dramatic as you might expect. I'm not sure if this is something that could be improved maybe with like a driver update, or whether this just is the limitation at the moment. We're probably averaging around about 115 frames a second rather than about 90 as we were before. So it is an increase, but it's still not going to be that drastic 165 Hz 1440p experience that you might expect. So I do wonder if there is a little bit more in the pipeline somewhere to come. However, having said that, it is actually worth considering an AMD graphics card if you pretty much exclusively play Warzone, because for some reason those cards really seem to favor performance in that game, and you tend to get better levels relatively to Team Green. You'll see all of this in the benchmarks that were shown just a second, but something like a 6900 XT on the used market, or maybe even a new 6950 XT, the prices of these are actually getting somewhat similar, especially to this overclocked version of the 4070, so that is worth considering if you pretty much just play Warzone. But I think you need to see the big picture. I think you need to see some numbers, and I'm not the guy to show you that, unfortunately. I never have been, I never will. Instead, I need to hand you over to the one, the only, Benchmarkers. Hello everybody, how are we doing? This is Benchmarkers, and let's jump straight into the numbers. And starting off with the 4070 itself, I would argue that the performance of this is actually pretty good for the most part. It's only about 16 FPS off the 4070 Ti, but obviously it is much, much cheaper. Even at 4K, it pretty much handles every game other than Cyberpunk over 60 FPS. So if you are looking to maybe get a 4K TV or monitor, and you're happy to turn the settings down in some games, this is actually going to be a perfect choice for you. Yes, 12 gigabytes of VRAM isn't as much as you'll find on AMD, but we didn't really run into any issues ourselves from running this, but in the future, this might change. The big win really for the 4070 versus the 3080 that it shares pretty much most of its performance with is when it comes to DLSS frame generation, or anything really where we're running ray tracing, because you will see better results there. So if you are looking for this sort of ray tracing card, Nvidia pretty much has it locked down. You should go with Team Green. Swapping out the resolution for 1440p, and this is definitely a GPU that is a lot more at home. Yes, you're still not going to hit a minimum of 100 FPS in every single title, but actually for the most part, we're pretty much seeing averages of 100 FPS or more in everything other than Cyberpunk with frame generation disabled. So I'd argue that's actually pretty impressive, especially given how intensive Cyberpunk can be. Interestingly, we do start to see a bit of an L when it comes to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 though, as at 1440p, this card is actually getting beaten by the RX 6700 XT, an older generation card that could be found for less money than this, but otherwise the numbers pretty much line up where you'd expect them to be. The only exception to this is actually the Gigabyte 4070 4070 itself, as you can see, it's essentially indistinguishable from the Founders Edition, and again, assuming you can buy them for the prices that they're set at, the RRPs, then clearly the Gigabyte card just offers worse value for money than the Founders, and I can't really see a reason to go for this Gigabyte one unless you're wanting to do loads more overclocking yourself, but you could probably do this with the Founders, or if the pricing availability essentially makes the Gigabyte a more attractive option. If there's like £10–20 in it, it doesn't really matter, but all the time there is a significant price difference between the Founders and the Gigabyte card, then the Founders pretty much makes a lot more sense in my opinion. I mean, to properly illustrate this, have a closer look at our cost per frame analysis. While the 4070 itself does actually offer pretty good value compared to the other new cards that have been released this year, that doesn't necessarily make it a fantastic purchase if you're paying a load more money for an overclocked version that just doesn't really give you any extra performance. In fact, the 7900 XT now actually slips between the 4070 Gigabyte and the 4070 Founders, so bear this in mind. That's, again, not to say you shouldn't buy this one, just don't overspend for a card that's not necessarily going to give you more performance. Something that is absolutely fantastic with the 4070 though is power consumption and I guess performance per watt, because we're only getting around about 200 watts or so max consumed while we're actually doing these tests, which is very, very impressive. Bear in mind the 4090 gets 415 watts, pretty insane. And in terms of performance per watt, you can see you're getting a lot better performance value with the 4070 compared to pretty much any other card at all. So long term, this is actually going to cost you less to run than pretty much all of the other cards we have tested, though with newer cards coming, I guess, in a few months' time, things like the 4060, 4060 Ti, chances are these will probably use even less. And so then, there you are, all the benchmarks I think you would ever need. What do you make of the performance? I mean, clearly, it is the best card of the generation when it comes to price to performance, but I still can't help but think that this should really be a little bit lower. Like, all of the stacks should cost less, but unfortunately it doesn't, and we are at this sort of crossroads when I would say I do recommend the 4070 overall, because you are still getting the performance that most people need. I think it's only really Warzone that was a little bit lower than I'd like. Everything else has actually been quite impressive. It can do the Cyberpunk, ray tracing, path tracing update, all of this stuff. It's a very capable GPU, but I do think it's probably worth waiting a little bit just to see what AMD do, how they counter, and whether they can actually start a little bit of a pricing war, because while it didn't happen with the 4080, I think that is a bit disappointing. There's no reason that it can't happen with this. As long as the stock is available, there isn't all of this scalping going on, then I think we are in a good position for PC gaming to get cheaper. But I think the 4070 is a very clear visual indicator that the cost of PC gaming at the moment is definitely at an all-time high, really, and that in itself is disappointing. But you should always buy based on the benchmarks, you should always buy based on what you're going to use it for, and overall the 4070 definitely is worth buying, and it is the best 40 series card. I think this, with DLSS 3.0, is finally going to enable ray tracing for the masses, which is great, but how many people care about ray tracing over all of the other things? Probably not that many, but fortunately the performance of this is good enough to back it up, especially in things like Apex Legends. However, having said all of this, this particular model, the Gigabyte Gaming OC, is great, but it is just too expensive, because you're looking at about £60 to £70 more when it comes to raw RRP for a card that doesn't really give you any extra performance. I mean, yes, the thermals might be slightly better, you've got more mass, I suppose, more air that you can properly move, but in reality, the Founders Edition is absolutely fine and is pretty much very similar when it comes to acoustic levels. And if you're looking at maybe like 1 frame a second more, I'm not really sure that's enough to warrant the extra price. But I think realistically, depending on when you're watching this, the prices are all going to sort of merge and they will get quite similar. So I'm not going to say you shouldn't buy this one, because it is a very good GPU. But if you have the choice between an entry-level one, something like an Eagle from Gigabyte, or a Founders Edition, or anything really like that, that doesn't have the same cooling performance, but actually offers the same sort of experience, then I think you should go for that and save yourself some money. But let me know your thoughts on this down in the comment section below. Have you enjoyed this video? Have you enjoyed the performance? Do you think the pricing is fair, or do you agree with me that it probably should be a little bit less and the whole situation with GPUs is still a bit of a mess? Let me know down in the comment section below, but smash the like button if you've enjoyed this, get yourself subscribed, and if you do want to check out current pricing on this particular GPU or anything else featured in this video, you can find that link down below with my Amazon affiliate links. And while you're down there, be sure to check out AlphaSync. AlphaSync brings you a worry-free PC gaming experience with a huge range of custom-built gaming PCs. With a 4.8 rating on Trustpilot and free next-day delivery available on selected builds,
Why not let AlphaSync take all of the stress out of PC gaming? Get started today with the link down below.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll catch you in the next one.